So I'm just going to talk about some more general liberal approaches, natural law approaches to sexual ethics. So beginning with kind of premarital sex. Well, a lot of liberal Christians these days would argue that if you're in a loving, committed relationship, which does not include marriage, so if you're a couple that are living together, raising a family together, you're still following the primary precepts. You're still educating. You're still protecting the young. You're still procreating. So the sacrament of marriage doesn't necessarily take away from those things. And so some liberal Christians don't necessarily take issue with or see anything wrong with couples living together and not being married. Realistically, they might have financial reasons for choosing not to, rather than kind of religious reasons, and so it's not necessarily a problem for them to just be in a loving, committed relationship without the sanctity of marriage. Another view, more related to homosexuality, really, is the idea that sex can kind of have more than one purpose. So sex can be an expression of love. It can be a unity between two people. It can be for procreation. All of these can be many. They're the many telos, many purposes of sex. And so to sort of say that you have to meet all of them every single time is not necessarily doesn't have to be the case. So perhaps you're having sex not necessarily because you're wanting to express love, but because you want to have a kid. You're in a committed marriage, but it's not really a situation where you're showing love for each other. You're kind of doing it in a more functional way because you're trying to conceive a child. There's nothing wrong with that. In the same way, if you're expressing love because you want to express, sorry for that again, if you're having sex because you want to express love or to show unity with your partner, which would include people having homosexual sex, then what's wrong with that? That's still meeting the one of the teloses, the purposes of sex, you could argue. So just because I mentioned the example earlier, I kind of thought of like a cheese grater. So if you're using a grater, it's obviously got different, if you see like a box grater like this, it's got different sides on it. So like one for kind of like peeling things into, one for grating, one for kind of slicing things, etc., etc. Fine grating on one side, etc. And so, just because this grater is only fulfilling one of its teloses, one of its purposes to grate cheese, and it's not kind of like fine grating garlic and ginger at the same time, or slicing potatoes and carrots, it doesn't mean to say that that cheese grater isn't, or the grater isn't fulfilling its purpose. You don't have to have all of those purposes fulfilled at once in order for something to be meaningful and for it to be fulfilling a purpose. So it's the same kind of idea with sex, really. It doesn't always have to be for procreation in order for it to be fulfilling its purpose and for it to be meaningful. All right, so part of the problem with Aquinas' view of sex and sexual relationships, his approach to sexual ethics, is that it essentially says that any sort of genital sexual act that doesn't lead to procreation is prohibited. So you can't have any sort of sexual contact with anyone or anything unless it's for the sake of making children, which obviously is not an approach or opinion that many people would want to adhere to, because there are lots of things involved in kind of genital sexual contact that people enjoy and people want to express or experience, rather, even if they're in a committed monogamous heterosexual relationship or if they're just on their own. So to kind of suggest that they're wrong, and not because they're not fulfilling their purpose is problematic, because again, what purpose? Maybe the purpose that you're fulfilling by like masturbating is just pleasure. You're trying to kind of release some happy hormones and get yourself through a tough time when you're feeling a bit down and rubbish. So, there's still a purpose being met there. There's a purpose to what you're doing in masturbation. And so, essentially, Aquinas is just being a bit too restrictive, essentially. The last view is the idea that kind of, according to modern science, the consensus is generally that like you don't regard something as deviant just because it's in the minority. So, and that's kind of how homosexuality was viewed for a long time in British society. It was viewed as a deviant behaviour, so kind of like abnormal and wrong. But the fact that it's not how the majority of people have sex doesn't necessarily mean that it's deviant, that it's abnormal or wrong, in any more so than kind of like being a different colour to other people, being in the minority that way doesn't make you deviant. Having a different hair colour, being left-handed, yeah, all of these things aren't things that make you deviant just because you're in the minority.